you're smiling in, smiling in, smiling in. And rightfully so, I've been trying to find you. I don't wanna say goodbye out loud. Doesn't matter where you're going, where you're going. Oh, oh. And rightfully so, no one else will. Love isn't meant to be alone. Doesn't matter where you're going, where you're going. I'll go home.
So we're back here. So we just kind of wanted to walk you guys through a brief overview of how each of us came to Christ, I guess.
A brief overview.
Yeah,
This is a business meeting.
Listen, I work a lot, so it's a brief overview. So I'll just start for me. So for me, I grew up in a Christian home in Tennessee, which is where I'm from. And I, went to church on Sundays and prayed before meals and things like that when I was young. I was baptized at church, and I probably said a prayer when I was 8 years old or so. I don't know how much weight that had as a 30-year-old man now, because my understanding of faith and walking and following Christ now is a bit different. It was probably that way all the way up until I was at the end of my high school years and the beginning of my years in college. Where I really started to question, why do I believe this? Why don't I believe something else? Is this really even true? Does it make any difference? A lot of questions when I was in college, because for those of you who went to college or have been on a college campus, like, you're exposed to all kinds of different beliefs and challenges, and people will laugh at you and be like, oh, you believe all those dumb stories in the Bible, and somebody living in a fish for 3 days, and I was thinking of all the things that people laughed at. So you really question, is that even possible? Could that even be true if I wanted it to be true, or have I just believed what my parents believe? So I went through a few years that were really difficult of that and classes and stuff at school. And to add that to that, I was married for 5 years when I was younger. And we were both like loosely Christians, as I described before. So, but it was probably less than that, really, because we didn't consistently go to church and didn't consistently pray for anything. So it was pretty loosely Christian. So towards the end of that marriage that ended,
That's awful.
There was, to make it brief, there was some affairs on the other person's part, and it was very ugly, and I wanted to stay, but the other person decided to leave, and that was really difficult for me. And so during that time period where it wasn't really official, but like all the stuff was happening, I was praying a lot. I was in a lot of distress, and I was very anxious, and was just asking God to like fix it and help me. And that didn't happen, which was really difficult on my heart and my faith towards God, I think. So I moved from there once she decided to leave. I moved from Tennessee to Ohio, which is where we are now, and was living with my brother for a few months. And my faith was a bit different for those couple of months, because I was angry at God for not fixing my marriage. I felt like He wasn't listening, and that He wasn't there for me when I needed Him. And so I didn't want to read, I didn't want to pray, I didn't want to do anything. I was playing video games like all day, every day, so I didn't have to think about it or feel about it. In that process, I met a couple of new people that are great friends now, that just sort of reminded me that even though people change and that person changed that I was with, that God never changes. And just because He didn't, make someone return and love me, like, doesn't make Him less of a loving God, because He doesn't force people to do anything. And they just sort of walked me through that really difficult time. And I started going back to church and started asking God for more help, and He came through, and He just sort of brought me back to Himself and the truth, and that was probably the first time in my life that I felt like my faith was like genuine and like deep and like rooted. I guess from all the trauma that'll do that to you, but I really feel like God came through and was close to me during that period of time. I was baptized again a few years ago, which I felt I really wanted to do because I'm not really sure I understood what baptism was, but that's probably a topic for another video. But yeah, I just take my sin more seriously now, and my desire to do what God asked me to do and what Jesus tells us to do in the New Testament. I take that more seriously and than I did before, and talk to him more, and he's here, you know, like he's here now if that's what we're filming, which may be weird, but so that's the end of mine. I think I'm sure you'll hear more about those details in other videos later down the road, but
Yeah.
it's the summary, the brief overview, if you will. Your turn.
All right. So my testimony is a bit different than Matt's. I did not grow up in a Christian, quote unquote, household. I remember my parents taking us to church on holidays, so like Easter, mostly Easter. And I remember as a young child being baptized. I don't really remember what that meant at the time, or who I was being baptized for or why. It was just something that my parents thought needed to be done, and so we learned the verse John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whosoever shall believe in him. See, I don't even remember the verse.
Will have everlasting life. It's the end of that.
We'll have everlasting life. So yeah, so that's how that worked out. Not very well. Anyways, so like I said, yeah, I didn't grow up in a Christian household. My parents took us to church on holidays. I remember when I was around the age of 7 or 8, I had a godmother. I have a godmother, and I would spend the summers with her, and she lived in Detroit, and I remember, would go to church 3 times a day.
A day?
3 times a day. 3 times a day, y'all. And so when we would spend the summers with her, we went to church 3 times a day. And I don't really remember anything from that time, except for I learned that I think that's when I began to believe that there was a God. When the summer was over, I didn't think any more of it. Fast forward to high school, I was a good student. I would have considered myself a moral person. I knew the difference between right and wrong and tried to just be a good person and do the right thing. I would go to parties, and I was dating, and I was not concerned about purity, and I had no conviction whatsoever. And then we fast forward to college. My first year of college, my dad passed away from cancer, and during that time, my dad and I were really close. I was what he would call his shadow, and so I really looked up to him. We would get into a lot of fights, but we would make up, and I was pretty much a daddy's girl. And when my dad passed away, I didn't know how to cope with that. I didn't feel like I had anybody that I could talk to about it that would understand. I had become an angry person. And so in that, I began drinking a lot. I began using marijuana. I began partying a lot. I would have still considered myself a moral person, but I was starting to explore what was out there, because when my dad had died, I wasn't sure if he had went somewhere or if his life was just over, or I just began to have questions. So I started looking on the internet and looking at YouTube videos about like metaphysical things and like ghosts and aliens and crystals and like the afterlife. And I started to just gather all of these different ideas and form my own beliefs about what life was about, what the purpose of life was, what was the afterlife about, and if there was one. At this time, my mom had started going to church pretty frequently, but I was an adult and I didn't live in her household anymore. So she would tell me about Jesus, and I knew that there was a Jesus. I didn't really look into it. I didn't really search for who Jesus was or anything like that. And I do remember like my mom saying, I'm just going to keep praying for you. Because I would tell her when she would talk to me like, okay, like, I don't believe that. In the midst of all of this, the search for spiritual things and being angry that my dad had passed away, and then drinking and the drugs that I was doing, I became pregnant with my daughter, Nora. And I remember feeling so depressed when I found out, and ashamed, and just more angry that this was something that, on top of everything I was dealing with, that I had to deal with now. And I was the person who never wanted kids. I was the person who I was very selfish. I wanted to do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it, and life was all about me, and I wanted a career, and nothing else mattered to me. I was not considering keeping the child, and there were a series of events that happened, which I'll mention. So I had let Nora's father know that I was pregnant and that I did not plan to keep the child, and he felt very strongly that he wanted to keep Nora. And so at the time, I was, like I said, I was ashamed. So I was trying to keep this a secret, that I was gonna have an abortion, and that I just wanted to let him know that that was what I was gonna do, and I didn't want him to tell anyone. And so what he did, because he felt very strongly that he wanted to keep the child, is that he reached out to my mom, he reached out to our friends and our family, and let them know like what was going on. And then at the time, I was very upset because that was something I felt was my choice, and I didn't think that he had the right to tell me what I should do, because it was my life. And I got a call from my mom, and she had said, Nora's dad called me, and are you pregnant? And I just remember like being so angry, because this was something that I was already ashamed of and I was already depressed about, but now everyone knows, and now I felt like I didn't have a way out, because I would be even more ashamed if somebody found out that I had an abortion. And so I felt like I was trapped, and that led to me being even more depressed, to the point where I was calling off work every day. I didn't want to hang out with anybody. I pushed all my friends away. I remember one day, one of my friends had reached out to me and had asked me if I wanted to go see a movie with her, and I hadn't been out the house in a few days, and so I had decided to get myself together and to go and try and get out of the funk that I was in. And so I went to her house, and we went to the movie theater, and I remember seeing a really funny movie, and during that time I laughed, and I felt a little bit better. My spirits were lifted. And then we went back to her house, and then I went to get my car to go home, and as I was driving out of her neighborhood, this like heavy depression, just heavy feeling just came back on me all of a sudden. Just like I had a moment of clarity and happiness and laughter and just being with my friend, and then I was right back to being where I was before. And I remember that I couldn't even get out of the neighborhood, and I stopped at the stop sign, and I just was sobbing. All of a sudden, there's no way to explain it except for like something was in my car, and it just became so peaceful. Like the sadness that I felt, the crying, everything, just like there was just this peace that was there. And I heard everything is going to be okay. And I had thought that I lost my mind because because it's like, you know, those movies that you see where somebody just like snaps and like they've lost their mind. Like that's how I felt. But it was different. It was I could tell like it wasn't in my mind. It was like just this peace within my car, and it was very strange, and I've never felt that before. And when I heard the voice, I immediately knew that it was God. I didn't think that it was like an angel, or I didn't think that, I don't know, whatever I could have thought, I didn't. I just immediately knew that it was God. And even still, after that moment had happened, I drove home, and I had kind of kept that for a few days, and then I forgot about it. And fast forward to Nora being born. Nora's dad and I decided that we were not going to be together, and that didn't work out for us. So I was a single mom, and I was going to college, and I was working a full-time job, and I had this baby who was so precious and so cute. I couldn't even have imagined how I would have not gone through with having her. And I mean, things were good. I had a really good job. We had gotten to a routine. I didn't really feel that I was struggling financially, but I think that I was struggling just still emotionally, because when you have a child and you're young, I think I was 23 at the time, you know, your friends who are that age are doing something else. They're not coming to hang out with you and your kid. So I was alone by myself a lot of the time. And I remember one day that I think I was having a really bad day, and the depression had started to come back. And I had prayed a prayer. I said, God, if you are real, if there is a God, please help me, because I didn't know what else to do. I had everything, but I still felt like I had nothing. And so I had prayed that prayer, and a few weeks later, a friend from a long time ago had called me and was like, hey, I go to this church. Do you want to come and visit? And I was like, sure. And I had remembered the prayer that I had prayed. And I went to church, and I remember specifically the day that I went, that Sunday, the message was try God. And so the pastor was talking about, you know, you've tried all these things, you've tried in your own strength to make your life work, and it still feels empty. Like, he described exactly what I had been feeling for a while. And he said, you know, just try God and see what happens. And so I'm a person who likes competition. I like challenges. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to try God. And my life changed after that. I started reading the Bible, and I could not stop reading it. And I started praying, and I started to go to church and be around a group of people who believed in this person called Jesus. And so I had learned the basics. So, like, Jesus was the Son of God, and that he had died for our sins. And like I said, I still had a lot of guilt and shame and depression and all of that I was carrying going through this process. And I was like, well, I can be forgiven for all of the things that I've done. And that was a huge selling point, if you will, for me. And so I said, okay, I'll believe this. So I did, and I got baptized. So I joined a seminary, and our church had a lot of serving events. And so I wanted to be a part of that. And so I jumped right in. I just started serving as much as I could. I started going to all the Bible studies. I started going to all the prayer meetings. I started going to all the anything that had to do with God, I was going to it. Looking back on it, things had become about perfection, trying to be a good person, trying to not do the things that I was doing before. So like cussing or drinking or staying pure or smoking weed, just trying in my own strength not to do those things, and then trying to give this appearance of like, I'm a perfect person, I'm serving here, I'm on this ministry, I run this ministry, I know all of these Bible scriptures, and I know these Bible stories, and I'm able to teach. And it just became about seeking the approval of the people around me, and trying to do things in my own strength. A lot of it was about that. And I crashed and burned. I would say about a year in, I crashed. I was tired. Like, all the things I had enjoyed doing at first became like a burden to me. And that was because I really didn't understand the gospel. And so the church that I was at, I actually ended up leaving and during that time, I was praying because I've had a sense that this couldn't be the life that I had read about in the Bible. It felt burdensome, and so I was like, this can't be it. This is too much like real life. In the Bible, God promises us an easy yoke and a light yoke and a different kind of life, and it felt too much like the life that I had before. And so I just began praying, like, Jesus, I want to know you. I want to know you outside of what people tell me you are. I want to know you personally, like, deeply. I want to know you. And at the time, I had come into a group of people who were running a small group. And I didn't recognize this at the time, but looking back, these people loved Jesus, and they knew Jesus. And I think that's what attracted me to them. They spoke about Jesus, and they told other people about Jesus, and they wanted to live out exactly like what the Bible said, as far as like how they were living their lives together. You know, I met with them, and they prayed for me, and they loved me, and in return, I just felt the love of Jesus from them. And I began to learn who Jesus really is and what he really did on the cross. And what I mean by that is that what I learned is that Jesus didn't die on the cross for me so that I could go and try and be perfect and do all these things and try and seek people's approval or try to be the best at this and the best at that. Jesus died on the cross because I can't do those things. And I can't keep up that lifestyle. And that expectation I can't meet. And so he died on the cross so that I could be imperfect. And I learned that. And I learned that I don't have to try and strive to be this perfect person for Jesus to love me. He loves me as I am. And in that, my only job is to just be obedient to the best of my ability. And so that burden that was on me of perfection and trying to please people was lifted, and I began to think and to have a relationship with Jesus that was more about love other than like fear. Because before I was acting out of fear. I would do things because I read in the Bible God struck people down because they didn't do what he asked them to do. And that doesn't take away from God's character at all. I'm not saying that God still doesn't do those kinds of things. But what I'm saying is that I was serving him for the wrong reasons. And so I began, because now I had this relationship and I understood where I stand with God, that he loves me no matter what. And that his mercy and his grace allows me not to be struck down if I do something wrong. I begin to serve him out of love, and I begin to serve other people out of love. And instead of the approval of man, I begin to seek the approval of God. And that's how I came to know Jesus. And at that point, I would consider myself a Christian, because at that point I had understood exactly what Christ did and understood who he was. And that's my story. So we just want to thank you guys for sticking with us. This is a little bit longer video than usual.
Probably like 10 times longer, actually.
But we thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear about you guys' testimonies. Mm-hmm. If you want to leave comments in the box, please feel free to do so. And if you want, or you have any questions for us, please feel free to leave comments for us as well. We would love to answer them. It was good talking with you guys. I hope you guys have a good weekend. Bye.
Peace out.